Well, Ethan, he always cherished the quiet days out on his Texas ranch more than anything. He especially loved those long, warm afternoons, the kind where the heat just settles in your bones. That's when a gentle breeze would drift through, carrying the sweet, earthy smell of sun-baked grass. And the setting sun would start painting these long, lazy shadows all across the sprawling land. It was his own little slice of heaven. That day, he was busy repairing an old, weathered fence line, the one that ran right alongside the gently flowing river, and his calloused hands moved with a familiar rhythm. He had a slow, steady patience about him. You could see it in the way he hammered each nail, driving each one home, solid and true, into the old cedar posts. The river was just a few steps from where he stood. It murmured along, soft and steady, making the kind of peaceful sound that could soothe a troubled soul. It was the kind of background music that made a hardworking man believe everything in the world was right, that the whole wide world was calm, predictable, and safe. But Lord Ethan had no idea. He didn't have a clue that his ordinary quiet day was just about to be turned completely upside down. It was fixing to become something so strange, so completely unexpected, it would defy belief. This was the kind of thing that would get the whole town of Prairie View talking for weeks on end. Folks would be gossiping over coffee for a good long while. As he continued his work, focused on the task at hand, he suddenly picked up on the faint, crackling sound of footsteps coming from down the riverbank. Someone was definitely walking along the muddy edge of his property. Now, at first, he didn't think much of it. He didn't pay it any mind, really. Plenty of folks, hikers and such, would wander through this part of the county. They'd come out to enjoy the scenery, especially when the Texas weather was being agreeable and mild. But then, something was different. The steady rhythm of the footsteps stopped all of a sudden. They just stopped cold. And that silence was followed by a small, sharp cry that cut right through the air. It was not loud, but it sounded so frightened and unsteady, it made the hair on his arms stand up. Ethan froze right where he was. His hammer hung in midair. He looked up from his work, using the back of his glove to wipe the sweat from his brow. His eyes, sharp from years of spotting cattle, scanned the long, lazy curve of the river. He followed the line of cottonwood trees along the bank, and that is exactly when he saw her. There was a woman standing dangerously close to the water's edge, all hunched over like she was in pain. She had one hand gripping tight onto a low-hanging willow branch, just trying to keep herself upright. It looked like she was using every last bit of her strength for balance. Her long brown hair was pulled back. It was tied back in a messy, loose braid that had come partly undone. She was wearing some pretty simple clothes, just a dusty-looking work shirt and a pair of sturdy hiking pants, both of which had seen better days. She had on a pair of good, sturdy hiking boots, the kind meant for tackling long, rugged trails. But even from a distance, Ethan could tell something was mighty wrong with the picture before him. Her right boot was sunk clear down to the ankle in a thick patch of that stubborn river clay. It was right there at the water's edge, and the suction had a powerful grip on her. She was yanking at her leg with both hands, pulling with all her might, but it would not budge. Her face was all scrunched up, a mix of strain and maybe a little bit of pain, too. Ethan took a slow step. He moved forward quietly, careful not to make a sound. She had not spotted him yet, too focused on her problem. He could see a flicker of worry in her eyes, but it was not outright fear, not the panicked kind. It was more like she was just plain stuck and getting mighty frustrated about her predicament. She looked worried, sure, but mostly she just seemed embarrassed, the way a person gets, when they know they need a helping hand but are just too proud or shy to ask for it. He recognized that look right away. He knew he had to be the one to speak up first. So he started walking steadily toward her, making sure his steps were clear, and called out, "Excuse me, ma'am? Are you doing all right over there?" His voice was calm and respectful. It carried easily across the quiet gurgle of the water, a deep and reassuring sound. She looked up in a flash, her eyes wide with surprise, clearly startled by his presence. She had obviously believed she was completely alone out here by the riverbank. For a second, she just stared at him, not saying a single word, as if she was trying to figure him out. She seemed torn, unsure if she should be relieved to see a potential rescuer or wary of a stranger. But then she got a good look at Ethan's face. and she must have seen something trustworthy there. He was tall and stood calmly, and his expression showed nothing but sincere, neighborly concern. She finally let out a shaky breath of air. "Oh, hello. I suppose I am okay for the most part. It's just that my boot seems to be stuck fast in this mud, and I cannot seem to get it out." Ethan nodded in understanding and moved a bit closer, stepping carefully from one dry rock to the next. "Well, let me take a look here," he said in a gentle voice. "Maybe a second set of hands will help." She shook her head quickly, her face flushing a little. "Oh no, it is just so embarrassing. I feel so silly. I really should have been paying more attention to where I was walking." He could see her cheeks grow warm with a blush as she gave her foot another useless tug. She tried to twist her foot, hoping to break the seal, but the thick clay did not budge one bit. It would not move at all. In fact, if anything, it felt like the suction was pulling her in even tighter, tighten around her boot. He could see that thick, brown muck just sucking down and tightening his grip around her fancy leather boot. First person to get caught in river. "Now don't you worry, ma'am," he said, his voice calm as a summer morning. "You are not the first person to get tangled up with this old river clay." "Clay," Ethan said gently, "happens more." Ethan kept his tone real gentle, trying to soothe the panic he saw rising in her eyes. "This sort of thing happens around here more often than you think." Normally he wasn't than you would ever guess, he finished. Now, truth be told, Ethan was not usually one for a whole lot of chit-chat. Type to talk much, but he could see he was a man of few words, preferring the quiet company of the woods. But one look at her pale face told him she needed to hear a steady voice, needed reassurance. She tried again too. She needed to know she was not completely alone in this mess. Gathering her strength, she braced herself and tried again with all her might. Pull her foot free, but the motion ended. She tried to wrench her leg free from the thick mud's embrace, but the heavy, unforgiving clay would not let go, and the sudden motion ended with a sharp wince. Ethan noticed it. With a sharp little gasp of pain, a wince that tightened the corners of her mouth. Ethan's eyes, used to spotting deer in the brush, did not miss it. Immediately. "You hurt?" he asked. He saw it right away. "Did you hurt yourself, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and full of genuine concern. She froze for a moment, hesitated. "I think so. My ankle." She hesitated, maybe a little embarrassed by her predicament. I I think so," she finally admitted softly. "It is my ankle. It pulls when I try to move." Ethan crouched. "There is a sharp pulling feeling every single time I try to move." Seeing her distress, Ethan slowly and carefully crouched down a few feet away so she wouldn't. He made sure to keep a respectable few feet of distance between them, moving with a deliberate calm so she would not feel cornered, feel pressured. He didn't reach for her. He knew a spooked person was a lot like a spooked horse. You had to be gentle. He did not reach a hand out toward her, didn't touch anything. He just observed. He did not make any sudden moves at all. He just stayed put and observed the situation, his mind working on the problem. The clay was thick and heavy, and her. That river clay was as thick as molasses in winter, a heavy, unforgiving goo that created a powerful suction. And her poor boot was wedged deep into it, was wedged deep inside of it, held tight as a drum. He knew that just trying to yank it out by force was a bad idea. Force it out could twist her ankle even. That was a surefire way to twist that poor ankle of hers even worse than it probably already was. It was a risk he was not willing to take. Worse. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. He decided to try a different approach, to build a little trust. "What is your name, ma'am?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Quietly. "Clara," she answered, her voice. He kept his voice quiet, hoping to be a calming presence for her. "Clara," she managed to say, her own voice so soft it was almost lost in the breeze. Soft. "I'm Ethan," he said. "Let me help." It was a tiny sound, full of worry. "Well, it is nice to meet you, Clara. I am Ethan," he said with a small, reassuring smile. "Let me help. You." Clara took a breath, nervous, but, "Get you out of this fix." Clara drew in a shaky breath, her eyes darting from his kind face to her trapped foot, her mind racing with nerves, trying to trust the situation. She. But there was something steady and honest in his eyes, and she found herself desperately trying to trust this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Tugged again lightly, but the moment she gave one more little tug on her foot, just a small testing motion to see if anything had changed. But the moment that sharp, fiery pain shot up her leg, she stopped. She shot all the way up her leg like a bolt of lightning. She stopped cold. A little whimper escaped her lips before she could catch it. Stared at Ethan for a long second, like. She lifted her head and just stared at Ethan for a long, silent moment, her eyes wide and searching his face, as if she were weighing all her options. Someone fighting an inner battle. Then, you could almost see the war going on inside her head, a fierce battle between her fear and her growing desperation. And then, a decision was made, with a mix of fear and determination. Her expression shifted, her features settling into a strange and powerful mix of raw fear and hard-won determination. She whispered the words that changed. She looked him straight in the eye, and so quietly he almost did not hear her. She whispered the strange words that changed everything. Everything. If I point it off, will you? It was a question that hung there in the quiet air between them, heavy with meaning. If I pay it off, she started, her voice trembling. Will you help me? Ethan blinked, confused for a promise to help me. Ethan just blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Take what off? For a second, he was completely lost. Second, take what off? My boot, she said quickly, cheeks turning red. If I take it off, I'll be able to pull my foot out. But I need someone to help with the boot. It's stuck too deep. I can't bend without hurting my ankle. Ethan hesitated, not because the request was strange, but because he wanted to make sure she didn't feel uncomfortable. He looked at the clay, then at her swollen ankle. He understood now that she wasn't asking anything unusual. She simply needed practical help. All right, he said gently. If you take it off, I'll help you, but only if you're sure you're okay with that. Clara nodded slowly. I don't want to make it worse. Ethan stepped back a little so she could balance herself. She held onto the tree branch again, steadying her breath. With careful hands, she bent forward and unfastened the boot. Ethan could see her ankle was already swelling, a soft reddish color spreading around it. She slid her foot out, biting her lip when a small wave of pain hit her. Ethan noticed immediately. Don't push yourself, he said. She shook her head. I'm okay. It's just sore. Now that the boot was off, Clara lifted her foot, ever so slightly. Her foot was finally free from the sticky, red clay, but the relief was short-lived. She realized she could not put any weight on it at all without her ankle wobbling like a newborn calf. Seeing her sway, Ethan moved forward in a heartbeat, his hands ready to catch her. But he stopped just short, not wanting to touch her without permission and startle her. You steady there? He asked, his voice calm. Clara gave a small, unconvincing nod, trying desperately to hide the tremble in her leg and the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. Just help me get my boot out of this mess, please. Why, of course, he answered warmly. We'll have it out in 2 shakes. He knelt down on one knee, not minding the mud, and took a firm hold of the top of her leather work boot. That Texas clay held on tight, like a stubborn fist, absolutely refusing to give up its prize. Now, Ethan was a strong man, but he didn't just yank on it with all his might right away. That wasn't his style. Instead, he looked around for a moment and picked up a sturdy wooden stick that was lying by the creek bed, bleached white by the sun, and carefully inserted the tip of it down the side of her boot, gently prying and wiggling it to let a little air in, working to loosen the thick clay's suction bit by agonizing bit. All the while, Clara watched his focused, deliberate movements with wide, careful eyes, her knuckles white from gripping the rough bark of the tree branch so tightly. Now, is any of this hurting you? He asked, his eyes glancing up at her face for a second. No, not at all. I am completely fine, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but she was truly appreciating his gentle and surprisingly clever movements. Ethan just kept working at it, slowly and methodically, giving the situation the kind of respect and care he always showed, whether it was with a spooked horse or a piece of machinery that just needed a patient hand. After about a minute of his careful work, he felt the stubborn clay finally start to give way. He set the stick aside, took a fresh grip, and pulled again, and this time the boot slid right out of the mud with a soft, wet sucking sound that echoed in the quiet air. He lifted the heavy, mud-caked boot and placed it on a dry patch of grass right beside Clara. "There we go," he said with a small, satisfied smile. She let out a long, shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding, and a faint, genuine smile touched her lips. "Oh, thank you so much." "You are mighty welcome," Ethan replied kindly, getting back to his feet and dusting the mud from his jeans. "But I reckon we are not quite done here yet. You surely can't walk on that poor, swollen ankle of hers." Clara finally managed to look down at her own foot, and her breath caught in her throat. The swelling was a whole lot worse now, puffy and angry, and she knew deep down she could not walk much farther on it. The path leading back to the main trail was nothing but loose rocks and tangled roots. A real ankle breaker. Ethan thought to himself, if she even tried walking on that alone, she might take a nasty fall and get hurt even worse. "Oh, I really do not want to be a trouble to you, Simon," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, it is not any trouble at all," Ethan said with a voice that was firm, but as kind as a summer evening. "You just let me help you get back to my old pickup truck. From there, I will take you straight on over to the clinic in town. You are going to need some ice on that, and for a doctor to take a proper look at that ankle." Clara paused for a long moment, but a sharp, throbbing pain shot up her leg, and that made the decision for her right then and there. "Okay," she finally whispered, giving in, "but I reckon I can hop on one foot." "No, ma'am," Ethan said softly, shaking his head. "You will surely fall and make it worse. I will just carry you, if that is going to be all right with you." Clara's eyes went wide with a spurwinordum. In her whole life, no one had ever offered her help so gently, with so much genuine respect in their voice. He was not being pushy about it, and he was not in any kind of rush. He was actually giving her a choice in the matter. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe enough to just nod her head yes. Ethan then stepped in close, moving real slow and deliberate, so she would not get startled or feel uncomfortable. He lifted her up so carefully, with one strong arm tucked under her legs and the other placed securely behind her back for support. Clara found herself holding onto the fabric of his shirt, just a little bit, trying her best not to feel like a burden or be embarrassed by the situation. Ethan walked with a steady gait, making absolutely sure she did not bounce or twist her injured leg, even a tiny little bit. "Well, you are as light as a feather," Ethan said in a plain, matter-of-fact way. It was not meant as a compliment, but more as a simple reassurance that carrying her was not a strain on him at all. "Like I am just a heavy burden on you right now." Through the throbbing in her ankle, Clara managed a weak, breathy laugh. It was a sound mixed with pain and the sheer silliness of it all. "You know," she said, "I do not think anyone has carried me since I was a little girl." Ethan just adjusted his hold, his strong arms making her feel completely safe. His voice was low and steady. "Well, ma'am, I reckon you picked the wrong patch of mud to trust today." With that, they started the slow journey up the grassy incline. He headed toward his old, dusty pickup truck, his steps measured and careful. Every move he made seemed planned, making sure he did not jostle her injured leg. He chose the smoothest ground for his worn leather boots to walk on. For just a second, Clara let herself relax and rested her head against his broad shoulder. She closed her eyes, allowing the leftover fear from her fall and the hot sting of embarrassment to finally start melting away. This was the very same rancher that folks in town always described as cold and unapproachable, a man who kept to himself. But here he was, showing her a level of gentle kindness she would not have expected from anyone, least of all him. Finally, they made it to the old work truck, its paint faded by the Texas sun. Ethan managed to pull the heavy passenger door open with just one hand, and he carefully, so very gently, set her down on the worn fabric of the seat. She started to stammer out another apology, feeling foolish for all the trouble, but Ethan simply shook his head, stopping her words before they could fully form. "There is no need to be sorry for needing a little bit of help. Every single one of us needs a hand sometimes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Clara looked up at him, truly surprised by the genuine warmth she heard in his voice and saw in his steady gaze. She had only come down to the river that afternoon hoping for a quiet, peaceful walk to clear her head. Instead of peace, she had found nothing but trouble and a twisted ankle. But somehow, right in the middle of that mess, she had met a man who, without any fuss or fanfare, was treating her with simple, quiet dignity and a profound sense of respect. Ethan then closed the truck door with a soft, solid click. Ethan took a slow walk around to the driver's side of his old pickup truck, the dust crunching under his worn-out boots. He slid onto the bench seat and turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life with a familiar, comforting sound. As they started rolling toward town, that big old Texas sun was getting tired, slowly dipping down behind the rolling hills. It painted the whole wide sky in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple, a truly beautiful sight to see. All the while, Ethan could not help but keep stealing little glances over at Clara, his brow furrowed with concern. He just wanted to make absolutely sure she was as comfortable as she could be. And sitting there, Clara felt a warmth spread through her. It was a feeling she had not experienced in such a very long time. It was simple, and it was powerful. Trust. And right there on that dusty back road, that is exactly how the first real chapter of their story together began to unfold. It was not anything they could have ever planned for, a truly unexpected turn of events on an ordinary day. It started out real quiet without any fanfare, and it all grew from one simple, trembling question she had asked him, a question that was all tangled up with her deepest fears in a tiny, flickering flame of hope. "If I take it off, will you help me?" Her words echoed in his mind as Ethan drove, his hands steady on the wheel. He took it real slow and easy down that long, dusty road, paying close attention to every little bump and rut. He was making absolutely sure that his old pickup did not jostle her around and cause her any more pain. Every few moments, his gaze would drift from the road, glancing over at Clara again to check on her well-being. He was trying to read her expression, to see if that poor, swollen ankle of hers was hurting her badly. For her part, she sat quietly, her hands folded neatly together right there on her lap, trying her best to sit perfectly still. You could tell she was hurting some, bless her heart. But even with the throbbing ache, she looked so much calmer than she had just a little while before. Maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time all day, she was beginning to feel genuinely safe from harm. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something about Ethan himself. His steady, reassuring presence had this unspoken way of making the whole wide, chaotic world feel like it was finally back under some kind of control. The windows of the truck were cracked just enough, letting the warm evening air drift on inside the cab. That gentle breeze did not just bring relief from the day's heat, it also carried the earthy scent of the tall pine trees and the sweet smell of the dry summer grass growing alongside the road. Feeling a bit of peace finally settle over her tired soul, Clara leaned her head back against the worn seat. She let out a long, slow breath, a soft little sigh that sounded as if the very last remnants of the awful fear from earlier were finally, slowly, leaving her weary body for good. "Is that ankle of yours giving you too much trouble?" Ethan finally asked, his voice low and gentle. "It hurts a little," she admitted honestly, her own voice barely a whisper. "But I reckon I will be all right. It's so much better than before. I truly cannot thank you enough for all your help. You were so very patient with me through all of that." "Now don't you go thanking me," Ethan replied with a kind voice. "Any decent person would have done the same. It was the right thing to do, that's all." But Clara gave him a certain look, a small, knowing glance that said she did not quite believe that was true. She couldn't help but remember those other hikers, the ones who had passed her just a little while ago. They had marched right on by, looking like they stepped out of a catalog. They had certainly seen her. They saw her wrestling with the mud, and they must have seen the pure panic written all over her face, and even so, they just kept right on walking, looking straight ahead as if she were just part of the scenery. They acted like she wasn't even there. Ethan didn't need to hear about that, though. She kept that little memory to herself. It just didn't seem important anymore. Not now, anyway. What really mattered was that this one good man, this stranger, had stopped. He was the one who finally offered a helping hand. "So, what did you doing out on this trail all by your lonesome?" Ethan asked, his tone gentle, after a comfortable moment passed between them. "Well, I just moved to this little town about 2 weeks ago," she began to explain. Her voice was soft, still a little shaky from the ordeal. To be honest, I don't really know a soul here yet. I thought taking a walk would be a good way to get to know the place a little better. This trail down by the river looks so beautiful and peaceful. I sure didn't expect to get into a fight with the ground. I never imagined that sticky clay would try to steal my boot clean off. Ethan let out a good-natured chuckle and nodded. Oh yeah, that old river clay is known for that. It catches folks off guard more than you'd think. Clara looked over at him, a curious and genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. Does it ever catch you? I mean, since you're a local and all? It sure did, Ethan said, his own smile widening. Got me good when I was about 12 years old. I managed to get myself stuck in a patch just a little ways down from here. I was sunk clear up to my knees in that muck. My daddy had to spend a good half an hour with the shovel. He was digging me out of there like I was an old fence post. He always joked that it was a true miracle. He said it was the only half hour of his life that he'd ever seen me be completely and totally quiet. Clara let out a gentle, happy laugh, her shoulders relaxing. She could just picture a younger, muddier Ethan, a little boy just covered from head to toe in that thick, brown river clay. The sweet sound of her laughter was unexpected. Hearing it made something warm and pleasant stir deep inside of Ethan's chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a very long time, a feeling he hadn't even realized he was missing. Ethan could not quite put a name to the feeling stirring inside him, but he sure did recognize it. It was a protective warmth, a feeling he had not allowed himself to have in a very, very long time. As his old pickup truck rumbled closer to the town, the bumpy dirt track finally gave way. The ride became much smoother on the worn asphalt. Clara sat up a little straighter, watching the small, familiar buildings. The dusty storefronts of their little Texas town started to come into view, one by one. There was the general store, then the cafe where all the town gossip was born, and the old post office. That old building had a sign so faded by the sun you could hardly read it, and then finally she saw it. The small one-story clinic was sitting right there at the end of the street, a beacon of help for everyone. Now it certainly was not anything fancy, just a simple brick building, but every single soul in that town knew you could count on the folks inside. They trusted the staff there with their lives, which meant more than any big city hospital. Ethan carefully pulled his truck. He eased into a parking space right out front and turned off the rumbling engine, letting the quiet settle in. The silence hung in the cab for a moment before Clara spoke, her voice soft. I can probably hop on inside from here. She said it quietly, trying to sound a whole lot braver than she felt. No, you will not, Ethan said, shaking his head firmly. There was no room for argument in his voice. You will just put weight on that ankle of yours and hurt it even more. You just sit still and let me help you now, he said with finality. For once, Clara did not have the energy to argue back. She just gave him a small, tired nod. Without another word, Ethan swung his door open and his boots hit the dusty pavement. He walked around the front of the truck, opened her door with a gentle click, and then carefully lifted her out. He scooped her up into his strong arms, just as gently as he had done back at the ranch, making it look effortless. She felt herself instinctively wrap one arm lightly around his broad shoulders, holding on to him. It was just a small gesture to keep her balance, but it felt like so much more. People in cars started to notice. A pickup truck driving by slowed to a crawl, the folks inside craning their necks to get a better look at the pair. It was not every day you saw the quiet, solitary rancher Ethan carrying a woman in his arms with such care. In a town this small, you can bet the whispers and the gossip started spreading over the phone lines before the truck's engine even had a chance to cool. You could practically hear the questions buzzing through the air. Well, who in the world is that with Ethan? I cannot believe my eyes. That is Ethan carrying somebody like that. It was a sight no one ever figured they would see. That fella always keeps to himself. I have never seen him with anyone before. But Ethan paid them no mind. He did not care one bit who was watching them from the street. His one and only thought was on the woman in his arms. His entire focus was on making completely sure that Clara was safe and was going to be taken care of properly. As he pushed the clinic's front door open with his shoulder, the air inside rushed out to meet them. It was that unmistakable, sharp smell of medicine and strong disinfectant, the clean scent of a place meant for healing. A kindly-looking nurse doing some paperwork behind the front counter suddenly looked up, hearing the shuffle of feet. Her eyes widened just a little bit in surprise at the sight before her. "Well, goodness gracious, what in the world happened here?" she asked with genuine concern in her voice. "This sweet girl looks like she's been through the ringer. She hurt her ankle pretty bad," Ethan answered, his voice low and steady, not wanting to cause a scene. "Her ankle gave out on her down by the water. She got herself stuck but good in that thick, sticky clay right by the riverbank. It took a minute to get her out." The nurse nodded with understanding and pointed to a sturdy examination chair. "Well, let's get her comfortable. Set her down right here, mister." With the utmost care, Ethan gently lowered Clara into the padded seat, making sure not to jostle her injured leg. The kind nurse immediately knelt down on the floor in front of Clara, her expression all business but her hands gentle. She carefully began to examine the swollen, mud-caked ankle, her touch surprisingly light and professional. Clara couldn't help but wince from the sharp poke of pain, but she bit her lip and remained remarkably calm through it all. Ethan took a few steps back to give them the room they needed, but he made it clear he was not going anywhere. He didn't leave the small examination room, choosing instead to stand watch near the doorway like a silent guardian. He stood there with his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his gaze fixed on Clara, just watching over her. His face was a mask of quiet, steady concern, a silent promise that she was not alone in this. "Well, I have some good news for you," the nurse said, looking up with a reassuring smile after a few moments. "It's not broken. But I'm not going to lie, it's sprained something awful. You're going to have to stay off it for a little while." She glanced over at Ethan with an appreciative nod. "You are one lucky young lady that he was there to bring you in." Clara turned her head to look at Ethan, and her eyes were so soft, filled with a deep and shining gratitude. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice just a quiet whisper. "I know I am." The nurse then got to work. She expertly wrapped Clara's throbbing ankle in a fresh cold compress that immediately started to soothe the ache. Then she gave Clara very clear and simple instructions on how to take care of the sprain over the next few days. Clara listened as carefully as she could, trying to memorize every single word the nice woman was telling her. She found herself nodding along at each step, but she couldn't help it. Every few moments her attention would wander. Her gaze kept drifting back across the room to Ethan, who was still standing patiently by the door. It was almost like she needed to keep looking at him for reassurance, just to make sure he was really there. She had a strange feeling that if she looked away for too long, he might just vanish into thin air. After the nurse finished her work, she patted Clara's good knee and stepped away to go prepare some more supplies. For a moment, Clara just looked down at her own neatly wrapped ankle, a stark white bandage against her skin. Then she slowly lifted her head and looked straight up at Ethan, her eyes wide with a quiet sort of wonder. "You stayed," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the quiet room. "I really did not think you would." "I ain't going anywhere," he replied, his voice calm and steady as the Texas plains. It wasn't loud, mind you, but it carried a kind of solid strength you could lean on, a certainty that settled her nerves. Clara managed a small, grateful smile, but then something shifted in her eyes. Her expression clouded over, like a sudden summer storm rolling in. It looked like a thought she'd been holding back finally broke free. Something painful that she had tucked away deep inside was now coming to the surface. "You know, two hikers walked right past me before you ever showed up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They came right up the trail," she explained, looking down at her hands. "They saw plain as day that I was in a real bind. I was stuck good and proper, and I called out to them for just a little bit of help. And you know what? They just looked at me and kept on walking." Ethan felt a hot, tight knot twist up in his gut. It was a feeling that settled heavy in his chest, a mix of pure anger and deep sadness. He wasn't even sure what riled him up more. Was it the cold-hearted idea of those folks just leaving her there, completely helpless and all alone? Just ignoring a person who was clearly in desperate need of a simple helping hand? Or was it the heartbreaking image of her, all by herself, feeling scared and forgotten out there in the quiet woods, forcing her to endure that awful fear for even a minute longer than was ever necessary? Well, ma'am, they just shouldn't have done that, he said, his voice low and rumbling, with a quiet fury. It was a downright shameful thing to do. But you, Clara's voice cut through his thoughts. You didn't hesitate for a single second. Clara said, a little strength returning to her voice. You heard me, and you came running right away. Ethan felt a little heat rise to his face. He was a man of action, not a man of words, and he surely was not used to getting praise for doing what's right. He scuffed the toe of his worn leather boot on the clean hospital floor, feeling a bit awkward and unsure of what to say. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. Heck, I just did what any decent person ought to do. That's just how folks are supposed to treat each other. Clara looked at him, really studied him for a long moment. In the few short hours since he had found her, since he had pulled her from that terrible ditch, she had learned something important. She had already figured out something as clear as a blue Texas sky about this quiet, gentle man. Ethan was the kind of fella who did not need to talk big or make a whole lot of fuss about himself. He did not brag about his strength, and he sure was not trying to impress anybody. There was no showing off in him. He just did what needed doing, plain and simple. He acted from a place of pure, uncomplicated honesty. And that quiet, steady honesty of his made a much bigger impact on a person than he would ever understand. He likely did not have a single clue how much his simple decency meant to her. Just then, the nurse bustled back into the room. She was carrying a clipboard with some discharge paperwork. Clara took the pen and signed her name on the dotted line, her hand moving slowly. She truly hated the thought of being a bother to anyone, especially this kind stranger who had already done so much for her. Ethan a moment longer. She felt like a real burden. You have already done more than enough for me, she said, her voice soft. I can just call myself a taxi. Honey, there is not a single taxi service in this whole town, the nurse said, giving her a warm, knowing chuckle. Believe me, your very best bet is this good man standing right here in front of you. Clara looked over at Ethan one more time, a little uncertain. He did not seem put out one bit. He was not looking at his watch or tapping his foot. As a matter of fact, he had a steady look in his eyes, like he truly wanted to make absolutely sure she got back to her own place safe and sound. It is no trouble at all. I will take you home, he said in a simple, calm voice. Clara finally nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest from his kindness. All right then, thank you so much. Without another word, Ethan gently lifted her once more into his strong arms, carrying her carefully through the small clinic and back out into the bright, warm Texas sunlight. Of course, all the people milling about on the main street stopped what they were doing and watched again, with some folks whispering behind their hands, some smiling kindly, and some just plain shocked to see it. You see, Ethan had always kept his own business and stayed clear of all the small town chatter. But on this day, he did not seem to care one bit who was staring or what they were thinking. The ride in his old pickup truck back to Clara's little house was mostly quiet, but it was a comfortable kind of silence. She looked out the passenger window for a little while, watching the fields roll by. Then she turned to him. Why exactly do people around here stare at you so much? She asked in a soft voice. Ethan just gave a little shrug of his shoulders. Well, I mostly keep to myself out at my place. I reckon people tend to notice when a quiet fellow all of a sudden starts doing something they did not expect at all. You mean like stopping to help out a complete stranger? Clara asked with a little smile playing on her lips. More like carrying that stranger right through the middle of town for all to see, he replied with a hint of a grin. Clara let out a laugh, a warm and light sound that seemed to fill up the entire dusty cab of his old truck. Truck feel brighter. The quiet ride in his big Ford truck felt safe, and the Texas sun seemed a whole lot brighter now. When they finally reached her small rented house on a quiet street, it looked like a tiny, hopeful little cottage at the end of a long, dusty lane. Ethan pulled the truck to a gentle stop, the engine rumbling low before he shut it off, plunging them into a peaceful silence. He got out without a word, his boots kicking up a little dust, and he came around to her side to help. He carefully scooped her up into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a feather, and carried her right up to the front door. Clara had to fumble in her purse for the key, and she managed to unlock the door while still held securely in his strong arms. As the door swung open, it revealed a simple living space with cardboard boxes stacked against a wall. It was obvious she was still unpacking, trying to piece a new life together from all those boxes. The curtains were only half hung on the windows, a little crooked even, but the place somehow felt incredibly warm and welcoming. You could just tell it was a place where someone was pouring their whole heart into trying to make it into a real home, a genuine sanctuary. With the utmost care, Ethan gently set her down on the worn but comfortable-looking couch. Clara had to tilt her head way back to look up at him, her heart fluttering. She was completely unsure of what to say. A big part of her truly did not want this quiet, peaceful moment to ever end. It felt so peculiar, but also deeply comforting to have a near stranger care about her so much, to show her such genuine kindness. This was especially true when most people she knew barely gave her the time of day. "Can I get you anything at all before I head out?" Ethan asked, his voice soft and respectful. Clara found herself hesitating for a long moment. Goodness, she really did not want him to leave just yet, but her pride wouldn't let her ask a man she just met to stay a while longer. But then she realized she did need something. "Could you possibly hand me my water bottle? It's right over there on the kitchen counter," she asked, her voice coming out as just a soft whisper. Ethan simply nodded, turned, and grabbed it for her in two long strides. When he came back and gave it to her, his work-roughened fingers brushed against hers for just a second. It was a light, accidental touch. It certainly was not intentional, but the unexpected contact made the moment hold a small, charged silence that neither one of them quite knew how to break. "Thank you, Ethan," Clara finally said, her voice filled with gratitude. And she meant it, really, for everything he had done for her that day. He just gave her a small, understanding nod. "If you ever need anything, and I mean anything at all, ma'am, I just live about 3 miles down this very road. You just holler, you hear? My door's always open, you hear? You can come knock any time, day or night." Clara looked straight into his kind eyes, past the dusty brim of his old hat, and she saw something real there. It was pure, unvarnished sincerity, as clear as a West Texas sky after a storm. These were not just polite words someone says to be neighborly. This was a genuine offer from a good man. He was the kind of person who meant every word he said, and she knew it deep down. "Well," she breathed, "I just might take you up on that offer." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Ethan gave a slow, understanding nod. He tipped his hat slightly and started walking toward her front door, his boots making a soft sound on the floor. But right before his hand reached for the doorknob to let himself out, he stopped dead in his tracks and paused. It was like there was something else on his mind, a final thought that just would not let him leave yet. He needed to get one more thing off his chest before he went. "You know," he began, "you were mighty brave back there today," he said, his back still turned toward her as he spoke. He did not even have to look at her to say what he felt. A whole lot of folks would have panicked when they found themselves stuck like that. But you, ma'am, you kept a real level head. Hearing those words, Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, her heart softening for the first time in ages. It had been so long since someone had finally shown up and offered simple, honest-to-goodness kindness. Ethan lowered his head a little, almost like he was shy about giving the compliment. Then he stepped out into the cool evening air. He pulled the door close ever so gently behind him, making sure it did not make a sound. Clara just sat there on her worn-out couch, her eyes fixed on that plain wooden door, long after the rumble of his old truck had faded away down the long dirt road. She had no earthly idea what tomorrow or the day after that was going to bring her way, but she knew one thing for certain, right down to her bones. That quiet, steady rancher from next door had just managed to change something deep inside her life, and bless his heart, he probably did not even have a single clue. Well, the very next morning, that small Texas town was already humming with activity. The local grapevine was working overtime, buzzing with quiet whispers long before Clara had even thought about pouring her first cup of coffee for the day. People down at the corner cafe were leaning over their tables, talking with their eyebrows raised clear up to their hairlines. The old fellow who ran the general store was telling anyone who would listen what he thought he had seen, adding a little extra each time. And you could see a couple of ranch hands leaning against a pickup truck near the feed store, passing the story along like it was the biggest piece of news to hit the county all year long. discovered a big secret. It was like the whole town had stumbled upon a hidden treasure, and everyone was just itching to talk about the same thing. The talk was all about that quiet, solitary rancher, Ethan, and how he was seen carrying a young woman through town like she weighed nothing. Folks swore up and down he held her as if she was as light as a feather, his expression calm but protective. They said his face was as calm as a summer morning, but his eyes held a fire that said, "Don't you dare mess with her." Most people had never seen Ethan react. Now, most folks in these parts had never seen Ethan get worked up about anything or anyone before. That way to anyone. He always kept to. He was a man who kept to himself, plain and simple, not one for idle gossip at the general store. Himself always did his work, always. He just did his work from sunup to sundown, minding his own business in his own land. Stayed far from unnecessary attention. That man avoided the spotlight like it was a rattlesnake in his path, always steering clear of any commotion. But yesterday, everyone saw him doing. But yesterday, well, yesterday was a whole different story. The entire town got an eyeful of him doing something completely different, helping, completely out of his usual character. There he was, in broad daylight, helping a stranger in need, someone who clearly needed him. And not just any stranger, but a woman who was clearly hurt and depending on him. And you know how it is in a small town. More people talked, the more the story. The more tongues started wagging, the taller the tale started to grow, stretching with every telling. Grew. Some said Ethan had rushed down. Before you knew it, the story had more twists than a barbed wire fence. Some folks were saying Ethan had charged down that trail, the trail like a hero. Others said like a hero straight out of a dime novel. Others were claiming he must have carried Clara half a mile carried that poor girl Clara a good half mile or more across that rough path. None of them knew the exact, rocky, unforgiving ground without even breaking a sweat. Of course, not a single one of them knew the honest-to-goodness truth. But they all agreed on one thing. But that little detail did not stop them from all agreeing on one solid fact, one thing they saw with their own two eyes. Ethan had surprised them all. Ethan, that quiet man, Ethan, had gone and surprised every last soul in town. Meanwhile, Ethan himself, however, spent his morning the same way, was starting his morning just like any other. The world could gossip all it wanted, but his chores would not wait. He always did, waking before sunrise. He was up and about long before the sun even thought about peeking over the eastern plains. Feeding the horses, checking the cattle. First came feeding the horses, their warm breath fogging in the cool morning air, then making his rounds to check on the cattle, and making repairs around the barn. But after that, he was fixing a loose board on the barn door. It was familiar, steady work for his hands. But still, even as he worked, his mind kept. Even as his hands were busy with the hammer and nails, his mind just kept wandering off, drifting back to Clara. He remembered. It kept drifting right back to the events of yesterday, right back to Clara. He could still picture her clear as day. How scared she looked when he found her. He remembered the look of pure fear mixed with relief in her eyes when he first came upon her out on that trail. The pain in her ankle, the soft way he thought about the sharp pain she must have been feeling in her ankle, and the soft, quiet way her voice trembled when she thanked him, and the quiet strength she thanked him for his help. He also remembered the surprising strength he saw in her. A quiet grit showed despite the situation. He didn't. That she showed even when she was hurting and feeling helpless. Now Ethan was not a man who usually think about strangers ever wasted his thoughts on strangers. Once he helped someone on their way, that was usually the end of it, helping them. But Clara's sweet, worried face stayed in his memory like a photograph he just could not put away. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Ethan finally had to admit to himself that he was plain worried sick. He hadn't seen or heard a peep from her since he left her at her little house. The town nurse had been clear that the ankle needed a whole lot of rest. But what if she took a tumble? What if she found herself unable to get around that big house all by her lonesome? What if she truly needed some help? At that very same moment, Clara was carefully, slowly getting herself out of bed. Her ankle still ached something fierce, but the pain wasn't that sharp, biting feeling from the day before. She tried to put her weight on it ever so gently, using the sturdy old bedside table for some much-needed support. Every tiny movement, every little shift was a powerful reminder of how incredibly lucky she was that Ethan had been walking along that river right when he did. She could still feel the strong, steady way he carried her, and she clearly remembered the genuine concern in his eyes and the quiet, warm voice he used when he offered his help without a second thought. She carefully made her way over to the front window and saw a couple of her neighbors walking by on the street. A few of them looked up right toward her house, their faces full of curiosity. She couldn't figure out why until she remembered how Ethan had carried her like a hero right through the town streets. Goodness gracious, that must have been quite a sight for everyone to see. A small frown touched her lips, not because she was the least bit embarrassed, heavens no, but because she certainly did not want folks getting the wrong idea about it. Ethan had only helped her because she was in a real bind. He simply saw a person who needed a helping hand, not for some big dramatic tale to tell his buddies later. Reason. That was the kind of man he was. No, sir, that was just the kind of fella Ethan was, a good man right down to his worn leather boots. She limped to the kitchen and made. Clara carefully hobbled her way into the small kitchen, with each step sending a sharp little reminder up her leg. Herself tea. As she sipped it slowly, she put a kettle on the stove and made a warm cup of tea, holding the mug with both hands as she sipped it slowly. Her thoughts kept drifting to Ethan. But her mind just wouldn't settle down, and her thoughts kept wandering right back to that quiet rancher. Ethan replayed the way he paused at her door. She kept replaying the scene over and over, especially the way he had paused for a moment right there at her door. Before leaving, the words he said about it was just before he turned to go, and she could still hear the low, steady sound of his voice saying those words about her. Her being brave and the unexpected. He had looked at her and called her brave of all things, which was the last thing on earth she felt at that moment. Warmth behind them. She couldn't stop. But there was a genuine warmth in his eyes when he said it, a kindness she hadn't seen in a long, long time, and she could not shake it. Thinking about the strange comfort she couldn't stop mulling over the strange and unfamiliar sense of comfort she felt when he was around. Felt around him, she had lived in bigger. It was a peaceful feeling that was completely new to her, and Lord knows she had lived in much bigger places before this. Towns around more people, but somehow. She had been surrounded by all sorts of people in bustling cities, but somehow she always felt like she was on her own. She had never felt the same sense of. It dawned on her that she had never, not for a single second, felt this simple kind of trust in another person. Trust she felt in the few hours she had. The feeling was so strong, especially considering she had only known the man for a couple of hours, which made no sense at all. Known this quiet rancher. Later this quiet, unassuming Texas rancher had left a bigger mark on her than people she had known for years. Later that afternoon, her peace was interrupted. Afternoon, someone knocked on her door. A polite but firm knock sounded on her front door, and the noise made her jump nearly out of her skin. Clara's heart jumped. She assumed it. Clara's heart gave a great leap in her chest. Her first thought was that it had to be the landlord, probably here to complain. Might be the landlord checking on her, or she worried he was just checking up on her, or worse, that she had already broken some rules she did not know about. A neighbor bringing something, but when? Her next thought was that maybe it was a friendly neighbor, bringing over a pie or something. But when she opened the door, she was wrong. She opened the door, she froze in awe. As she pulled the door open, Clara froze right where she stood, her eyes wide and her mouth falling open in complete surprise. Surprise. Ethan stood on her porch, holding a small brown paper bag he was holding a little brown paper sack in one hand, the kind you get from a general store, and a bottle in the other. Bottle of sports drink. Thought it was a brightly colored sports drink, the kind with the electrolytes. Well now, he said gently, I thought you might be needing these. Might need these, he said calmly, but he said it in that same steady voice she remembered from before. But this time his eyes told a different story. There was a hint of shyness in his. She could see just a hint of shyness in his expression, and he sort of ducked his head a little as he spoke. Voice. Clara stared for a moment. Then his voice was a bit softer too. Clara just looked at him for a long moment, completely taken aback by his thoughtfulness, and then she smiled. Smiled. You didn't have to come all the... It was a real smile, the first one in a while. My goodness, you absolutely did not have to drive all the way back out here. Way here. I know, Ethan replied, but... I know that, Ethan replied, finally meeting her gaze directly. But I got to thinking on the drive home, and I got a little worried. I wanted to make sure you're doing all. I just wanted to come by and make sure you were doing all right, being out here all by your lonesome. Right. Clara stepped aside slowly. Duke. His simple honesty was disarming. Clara moved back from the doorway, opening it wider. Well, would you like to come in for a minute? Why don't you come on in for a spell? Ethan paused on the doorstep, feeling a bit out of place. He was a working man, far more accustomed to being in the backyards and garages of other folks' houses, but only when he was there to fix a leaky pipe or haul away some old furniture. Never as a guest. But something was different here. The genuine warmth in Clara's eyes made him feel a sense of ease, a true welcome that was as rare and refreshing as a cool breeze on a hot Texas afternoon. Well, if you're sure it's no trouble, ma'am, he said, his voice low and respectful. She gave him a reassuring nod, and he carefully stepped over the threshold into her home. His eyes took in the room, noticing the stacks of half-unpacked cardboard boxes, the simple, sturdy furniture, and the way the golden sunlight poured through the clean window panes, lighting up the whole space. It certainly was not a grand or fancy house by any stretch of the imagination, but you could feel that someone was pouring their heart into making it a warm and peaceful sanctuary. Clara motioned toward a simple wooden chair, and he sat down on the very edge of it, ever so carefully, after he took a moment to toe off his dusty work boots right by the welcome mat, so he would not track any dirt across her clean floors. How is that ankle of yours doing today? He asked, his concern plain in his voice. Oh, it's feeling a little better than it did yesterday, Clara assured him with a small smile. It is still mighty sore, mind you, but at least I can get around on it a bit, just as long as I go real slow. You ought not be walking on it too, Mom, he gently advised. If you happen to twist it again before it's ready, it'll take twice as long to heal up right. She eased herself into a chair across from him, her eyes studying his face with a kind and thoughtful expression. You carry a lot of concern for other people, don't you, Ethan? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her direct and gentle observation. Well, I do not know about a lot, ma'am, but I suppose I do worry some when I see a good person who could use a helping hand. A genuine smile spread across Clara's face. I'm starting to believe that is just the kind of man you are. They fell into a comfortable silence, and then began to talk quietly for a little while after that. Clara started telling him all about the little town up north that she had called home for so many years before moving here. She started talking all about her dream job at that little town library, the one she was so excited to get started at. She was fixing to begin her new chapter there real soon, and you could just hear the pure hopefulness in her voice. Then she went on to explain her special fondness for exploring all those forgotten, quiet places nobody else bothered with. She said they held stories most folks were too busy to hear. And all the while, Ethan just sat there taking it all in without a word. He'd give a slow, thoughtful nod every now and then. And after a comfortable pause, she gently turned the conversation to him. She asked him about the sprawling ranch that was his whole world, and then she wondered aloud about the family who raised him. Finally, in a soft voice, she asked him exactly why he always seemed to prefer his own company, way out here by himself. Now, Ethan was not a man of many words, that's for sure, and talking about himself felt as foreign as speaking another language. But there was something truly special about Clara, a genuine kindness in her eyes that made him feel he could let his guard down. He didn't spill his whole life story, not by a long shot, but he shared just enough to give her a little glimpse of the real man inside. He offered up these small pieces of his heart, like treasured old photographs, starting with stories about his respected daddy. He remembered his father's calloused hands patiently showing him the right way to mend a broken fence line on the property. He also talked about learning how to properly tend to the livestock and what it was really like to grow up under that big Texas sky. His whole childhood was spent out in those wide-open fields with nothing but the horizon, and he tried to explain the peace in it. He explained how the steady, quiet rhythm of ranch life was a true comfort to his soul, something he could always count on. You know, she said with a little smile, you're not nearly as quiet as all the folks in town seem to think you are. Clara said this so softly, and Ethan looked right over at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and genuine curiosity. He was truly puzzled by her comment and mumbled, I didn't reckon people were saying much of anything about me at all. The very thought that he was a topic of conversation was completely new to him, as he figured most people barely noticed him. Oh, Ethan, she said kindly, the whole entire town is buzzing about you, and they haven't stopped since yesterday afternoon. Well, specifically, she explained gently, they are all talking about the incredible way you carried me all the way back home. Why, just this morning I couldn't help but overhear two ladies at the general store wondering what had gotten into you. They were asking each other if you'd suddenly decided to become the town's unexpected hero, she said with a small laugh. At her words, a faint warmth crept up his neck and settled in his cheeks, a truly rare sight for the stoic rancher. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and grumbled, folks are just making a big old mountain out of a tiny molehill. But Clara just shook her head, her eyes turning serious. No, Ethan, it truly wasn't nothing. It meant the world to me. You helped me when I was in a real bind, and you didn't even hesitate or ask for a single thing in return for your trouble. Well, that kind of selfless help is a mighty rare thing these days, she finished softly, leaving Ethan staring at his boots, unsure what to say. He never did know how to handle a compliment. They always felt like wearing clothes that just didn't fit him right at all. That praise always made him feel mighty uncomfortable. But hearing those kind and honest words coming directly from Clara felt different. For Clara, this whole moment felt different, like a breath of fresh air. It was real and honest, and it settled deep in her heart. Ethan found he could not deny it, not for a second, the genuine gratitude shining in her eyes. Well, it meant a whole lot more to him than he ever would have expected. It warmed him up from the inside out. After a moment of comfortable silence passed between them, Clara shifted a little on the couch cushions. She turned to face him more directly and said, Ethan, there is something I really want to tell you. When I was stuck out there on the road yesterday feeling so helpless, I watched as two different people walked right on past me. They did not so much as glance in my direction. In that moment, I truly felt completely invisible, like I was just a ghost on the side of the road. She paused and took a steadying breath. But then you came along, Ethan. You did not just look at me, you actually read me. You did not hesitate for even a heartbeat, and for that I am more grateful than words can say. Ethan's brow furrowed just a little, not out of any anger, but from a deep and profound sadness. He just could not wrap his mind around how any person could just walk on by and ignore someone who clearly needed a helping hand. Folks ought to do a whole lot better than that, he said, his voice low and steady. Yes, they should, Clara agreed with a quiet nod. But you know, sometimes it only takes one person to do the right thing, and with that one single person makes all the difference in the whole wide world. Hearing her say that, something powerful stirred deep down inside of Ethan. It was a quiet feeling, but it was as strong and steady as an old oak tree. He did not have to say a single word back to her. The raw emotion plain in his eyes told Clara absolutely everything she needed to know in that moment. She knew he understood. After a little while, Ethan finally stood up to leave. Now, if you need anything at all later on, you give me a call. I truly mean that, you hear? Clara looked up at him from the couch, her own voice coming out soft and full of sincerity. Then you have already done more than enough. For just a second, Ethan hesitated by the door, and then he slowly shook his head. Shucks, ma'am, I have not done anything special at all. Just what anyone ought to do. But Clara knew better. She believed with all her heart that he had. Before he walked out of the door, he reached over and carefully placed the simple brown bag right there on the coffee table. Inside that little paper sack were just a few simple things, the kind of practical items you find at the corner store. Tucked right beside a cold pack were some plain bandages and a small cellophane package of cookies he had grabbed on a whim. He had no earthly idea if she even liked them, and right next to those was a bright blue sports drink. Clara looked up from the bag, a small, curious smile on her face, and asked, "Why the cookies?" A soft little laugh escaped her, the first genuine sound of happiness he'd heard from her. Ethan, bless his heart, immediately rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. "Well, I just thought you might want something a little sweet after everything," he mumbled, his cheeks feeling a bit warm. Clara's whole face softened into a warm smile. "In that case," she said, her voice gentle, "I am going to enjoy every last crumb." Ethan, feeling his part was done, took a step back towards the front door, but he stopped with his hand on the knob, pausing for just a second as if there was a whole other conversation happening inside him, a powerful urge to say just one final thing before he left for good. He turned back and said, "You know, you're a whole lot stronger than you probably think you are," he finished, his voice quiet but steady in the still room. At his words, the weary tension around Clara's eyes seemed to melt away, and they softened with gratitude. "That's only because someone kind decided to show up at the exact right moment," she replied, giving him all the credit for her newfound resolve. He just gave her a single firm nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Then he finally opened the door and stepped out into the fading afternoon light. As he began the familiar walk down the quiet street, his mind was a million miles away. He certainly did not notice the curtains, twitching in the windows of the neighboring houses, or the faint sound of quiet whispers that were already starting to spread through the neighborhood again. All that he could possibly think about was the surprisingly gentle and grateful look in Clara's eyes. It was coupled with the powerful feeling that, for the very first time in a long, lonely while, he had finally made a true connection with another soul, someone who truly saw past his rough exterior. She didn't just see the quiet rancher who always kept to himself, but she saw him as a real person, a man who was actually worth the time to get to know. And back in her small living room, Clara moved to the window, watching him walk slowly down the road until he was just a silhouette. Away from her house, her heart feeling strangely calm yet completely full. She felt it deep in her bones that her life had just taken a sharp turn, and she had absolutely no idea where that new road would lead. But for the first time in ages, she felt a little bit of hope. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next few days moved quietly, but for Clara and Ethan, something inside both of them had begun to change. Clara stayed home most of the time, resting her ankle the way the nurse advised. She followed every instruction carefully, keeping her foot elevated, using cold compresses, and avoiding unnecessary movement. Even so, every time she tried to stand up, a soft ache reminded her how she had ended up stranded every time she remembered. She also thought of Ethan. She thought about the steady strength of his arms when he carried her, the kindness in his voice, the calmness in his eyes. She had moved to this small town hoping for a fresh start, but she hadn't expected someone to make her feel welcome so quickly and so sincerely. Her ankle might have been the reason they met, but her heart told her their connection came from something deeper. Meanwhile, Ethan tried to keep his days normal. He worked the ranch, fed the animals, repaired the barn roof, and delivered hay to a neighbor who needed help. But it did not matter what chore he set his mind to, whether it was mending a fence line or checking on the cattle. Clara's face just kept popping into his thoughts. It was a constant, gentle distraction. He found himself pausing to wonder if she was getting along all right. He hoped her arm was healing up proper, and he worried if she had enough good food in the pantry to keep her strength up. Most of all, he worried she might be feeling all alone in that little house of hers, which he knew she was still trying to make feel like a real home. It was more than just a passing thought. More times than a man like him would ever want to admit. Even to himself, he found his hands just stopping their work. He would just be standing there, in the middle of a field or by the barn, completely lost in thought. His eyes would drift off, staring down the long, dusty road that wound its way back toward town. The very same road that he knew led right to her little street. By the time the fourth day rolled around after her fall, Ethan finally decided he had had enough of all this useless worrying. It just was not doing anyone any good. He gave in to that nagging feeling that had been building up inside his gut like a slow burn. The concern had become too big to ignore. So he went inside and washed the day's grime from his hands and face. He pulled on a clean shirt, one that was not stained with sweat and dirt, and got into his old truck to head into town. As he drove, he noticed his heart was thumping against his ribs just a little bit harder than it usually did. It was a strange feeling, and it picked up speed as he pulled his truck to a stop right there on the street outside her house. He sat there for a second, looking at Clara's little place. He could not for the life of him figure out why he was feeling so jittery, like a young kid on his first date. Lord knows he had helped her before without a second thought. That was just being a good neighbor. But this visit, showing up on her doorstep like this, well, it felt entirely different. It was not about a leaky roof or a fallen tree this time around. This felt a whole lot more personal, and that made him uneasy. He finally got out and walked up the path to her front door. Taking a steadying breath, he raised his hand and knocked gently on the wood. After just a moment, the door creaked open, and there was Clara. She was leaning just a little bit on the arm of a nearby couch, clearly still favoring her injury. She was using it for a bit of support, but her eyes, well, they just seemed to sparkle when she saw him standing there. Her whole face lit up with a genuine warmth that chased away his nerves. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft and surprised. A lovely warm smile spread across her face. "Well, I certainly did not expect to see you today." He felt a bit awkward and immediately offered, "I can always come back another time if you are busy or resting." He said it a little too quickly, feeling like he was intruding. "Oh no, not at all," she insisted, shaking her head with a gentle smile. "Please do not go. I am so very glad that you came by to visit." Hearing those words, Ethan felt a knot of tension he did not even realize he was holding, finally loosen inside his chest. It was a deep, welcome feeling, something mighty close to relief. It was clear now that Clara was happy to see him. I moved out of the way, holding the door open so he could come inside. He stepped across the threshold, finally inside the house he had heard so much about. The whole place looked a little more lived in than the last time he was there, more like a real home. A few of the cardboard boxes had been unpacked and put away, which was a good sign. He saw a few framed pictures now resting on a wooden bookshelf, just waiting to be hung up. There was a soft, handmade quilt with a star pattern draped over the back of the old sofa. It was clear to him that she was slowly but surely building a real home for herself here. "So, how's that ankle of yours doing?" He asked, his voice full of genuine concern. "It's better," she answered with a small, grateful smile that lit up her face. "I can finally walk on it a bit. As long as I'm real careful. I have to take it slow, you know." "Well, you make sure you still rest it up," Ethan said, sounding a bit like a worried mother hen. Clara let out a light, airy laugh. "I had a feeling you were fixing to say that." Hearing her laugh, he smiled back, a soft and almost shy kind of smile that rarely showed itself. It was the kind of smile that made Clara's chest feel all warm inside, like a sip of hot cocoa. She gently gestured with her hand toward a nearby chair, inviting him to sit down and stay a while. Ethan took a seat in the comfortable-looking armchair right across from her, but he did not quite settle in. Clara could not help but notice how he sat there with a quiet kind of tension in his shoulders. He was wound up tighter than a $2 watch, as if he had something important he wanted to say. But it seemed like the words just would not come out, like he did not know where to start. She watched him for a quiet moment, letting the silence stretch just a bit. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" she asked, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. Ethan's eyes immediately dropped to the floorboards. He studied his worn-out boots for a second before finally looking up. "I just wanted to come by and see, to make sure you were truly all right. I know folks sometimes say they are fine when they are not. Everybody heals at their own pace, and well, I did not want you to think that you had to feel like you were dealing with all of this mess completely by yourself, that you were not alone." Clara's whole expression just softened then, the worry lines smoothing out. "You know," she said softly, I have not felt the least bit alone since the day you first showed up. Not since that very first day. Ethan's head snapped up to look right at her, his eyes wide. He seemed genuinely taken aback by the pure, simple sincerity he heard in her voice. For a moment, he looked like a man who had completely forgotten how to speak. So instead of trying, he just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. The silence that settled between them afterward, it was not the least bit uncomfortable. It was warm and easy, like a peaceful Texas sunset. They sat there in a comfortable silence, like two old friends on a porch swing. It was the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled with chatter. After a good long while, Clara finally turned to him, breaking the peaceful spell. She had a little twinkle in her eye and a soft smile playing on her lips. I reckon you know you are the talk of the entire town, Ethan. Ethan let out a long, weary sigh, looking down at his worn leather boots. Yeah, I figured as much. Oh, it is more than that, Clara said, her tone light and teasing. They are saying you looked like some kind of hero. He shook his head, a little embarrassed by the very idea. Well, I certainly was not trying to look like anything. All I was doing was giving a hand to a neighbor who was in a bind. No, she said, and her voice became serious and gentle, drawing his eyes back to hers. That is the very reason why people cannot stop talking about it, Ethan. You did something that was just plain decent and honest without a second thought. And in this day and age, that kind of pure honesty can truly take a person by surprise. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning softly, and he really thought about what she was saying. Now, this man was not the type to ever go looking for the spotlight or want a pat on the back. He was a humble soul who did what was right, simply because it was the right thing to do. If anything, he always went out of his way to stay in the shadows, far from prying eyes. But sitting there with Clara, he did not feel like he was being judged or looked at funny. She was not making him feel like some strange creature in a sideshow for doing what felt right. Instead, for the first time in a long time, she made him feel completely and truly understood. Clara took a slow, deep breath as if she was gathering up her courage to say something important. Can I tell you something personal? Of course, Clara, he answered without a moment of hesitation. You can tell me anything at all. When you carried me through the middle of town, she began, her voice low as she picked her words with great care. With every single person watching us, I know I should have felt embarrassed. But I did not feel that way, not for one single second. Instead, I felt protected. I felt so incredibly safe, like for the first time in forever, someone in this world genuinely cared about me. Hearing those words, a powerful feeling tightened deep inside Ethan's chest. It was not a painful feeling, but a deep, protective pull that made him want to move closer to her. It was a fierce and sudden need to shield her from all the hurt in the world, from every single fear. He wanted to protect her from every lonely moment she might ever have to face again. I am real glad you felt that way, Clara, he said, his own voice thick with emotion. That means the world to me. A comfortable quiet settled between them once more, just letting the peaceful moment hang in the air. Then out of the blue, Clara let out a little laugh that caught him completely by surprise. It was a light, airy sound like wind chimes on a summer porch, and it made Ethan's own heart feel a little lighter. What's so funny about? He asked, his voice full of genuine, gentle confusion. Oh, I just had a memory pop into my head, she said, her eyes sparkling with the thought. It was about that little paper sack you brought with you the last time you stopped by. You handed me those cookies, and bless your heart, I just wasn't feeling hungry at all that evening. But the next morning with my coffee, I sat down and I swear I ate every last one of them. Ethan let out a low, warm chuckle that rumbled in his chest, feeling a bit embarrassed but pleased. Well, I'm afraid those were the only kind the little market down the road had, he admitted with a shrug. They were absolutely perfect, she insisted softly. It was the kindness behind them that mattered most. Now, Ethan was not a man who was used to getting compliments, not by a long shot, but hearing those sweet and simple words coming from Clara didn't make him feel awkward at all. Instead, a pleasant warmth spread right through his chest, as comforting as the Texas sun. After a little while longer, Clara shifted and said, I think I might be more comfortable if I moved. She gestured from the soft couch toward the small, sturdy dining table nearby. It might just be a better spot for my ankle to sit for a spell, she explained. Ethan was on his feet in a heartbeat, ready to help her without a second thought. As she stood, she placed a hand ever so lightly on his forearm, just to steady herself. That simple, small touch, the delicate pressure of her fingers against his skin, felt electric. The pure trust she showed in that simple gesture made Ethan's whole world stop for a moment. He held his breath, guiding her with the utmost care, moving slowly and deliberately. He was so focused on making sure her poor injured ankle was protected from any strain. He didn't want it to twist or bear any weight, not even for a split second. Once she was settled safely in the dining chair, a wave of relief washed over him. Then, instead of taking the chair opposite her, he chose the one right by her side. Clara definitely noticed that small, significant change in where he decided to sit. A quiet, knowing little smile played on her lips as she looked at him. "You are such a careful man, Ethan," she observed, her voice soft and full of appreciation for his gentle nature. "Well, I reckon it is always better to be safe than sorry," Ethan replied with a humble smile of his own. Clara looked at him thoughtfully, her head tilted slightly. "You know, Ethan, I have been sitting here thinking. You have such a natural way of looking after people, a real kindness that seems to just pour out of you. But has anyone ever really taken care of you that way?" Ethan paused, his coffee cup stopping halfway to his lips. Her question wasn't just small talk. It reached a quiet, dusty corner of his heart that he rarely ever visited. It was a place full of memories he kept locked away. "My father," he said, his voice a little thicker than before. "He was the one," he finally said, looking out the window. "But we lost him a good number of years ago. It has been a long while now." Clara's face softened with genuine sympathy. "Oh, Ethan, I am truly sorry to hear that." She spoke so gently it soothed the hurt he didn't realize was still there. "It is all right, ma'am," Ethan replied with a small, sad smile. "He was a good man. He taught me pretty much everything I know, from how to fix an engine to how to fix your character. But his biggest lesson, the one that stuck, was always about how to treat folks." He took a moment, lost in thought. He then added, "He always used to say, 'Son, doing the right thing is not supposed to be hard. It becomes the easiest thing in the world when you truly care.'" Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. "And you cared," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "You cared enough to help me, a total stranger. You did not know me at all, but you showed up anyway." Ethan finally lifted his head and met her gaze straight on. "I still care, Clara." The way he spoke her name sent a comforting warmth spreading through her like sunshine after a storm. It was a feeling of safety she had not known in a very long time. She held his steady gaze, seeing nothing but pure honesty there. For a long moment, the busy diner around them seemed to fade away. Feeling a blush rise to her cheeks, she looked down at her folded hands. She struggled to find the right words for the new, hopeful feelings that were blooming in her heart like wildflowers in the spring. So instead, they just kept talking. The conversation flowed between them for at least another hour, easy and comfortable. They talked about the simple things in life and the ups and downs of living in a small town where everybody knows your name. They shared old dreams and talked about life's little chosen, the kind of things that truly matter in the end. Each story and every shared smile was like another thread, slowly and gently weaving their two worlds together. Nothing about it felt forced or awkward. It was just natural. All the while, the afternoon sun began its slow journey downward. Through the large diner window, the Texas sky began to paint itself in shades of orange and deep purple as the sun went down. That beautiful golden light poured into their booth, wrapping them in a soft and forgiving glow. As the light in the room shifted, so did the feeling between them. Clara looked across the table at Ethan, her heart feeling suddenly full. An unexpected wave of tenderness washed over her. "Ethan," she began quietly, "is it all right if I ask you something a bit more personal?" He simply nodded, his eyes kind and open. "You can ask me anything you want." She took a small, steadying breath. Why did you, why did you really come to find me today?" The question hung in the quiet air between them. Ethan took a long, slow breath. He was a quiet man by nature, the kind of person who weighed his words with care before ever letting them go. Ethan was not the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve, you see. But something about this day felt different. The whole world felt different. And Clara, well, she seemed different too. He looked right into her eyes, and the quiet strength he saw there made it just plain impossible to keep his feelings tucked away. It's because I couldn't stand the thought of you being all alone here, he said, his voice low and earnest. And if I'm being honest, I just really wanted to see you for myself. Hearing that, Clara's whole expression softened in a way that just about made Ethan's world feel 100 times warmer than that big old Texas sunset painting the sky outside. Well now, she whispered, a small smile forming, I am mighty glad you came over. And before he could even think of what to say in response to that kindness, the quiet moment was interrupted. They heard someone outside holler a friendly greeting to a passing neighbor. That sudden cheerful sound reminded them both that life was still going on right outside the thin wooden walls of her little house. But inside, time felt like it was moving slow and easy, like honey dripping from a spoon. After a while longer, Ethan finally stood up, knowing it was time to leave. Clara insisted on walking him to the door, moving slowly and carefully, leaning her hand against the wall to keep her balance. When he reached the open doorway, he stopped and turned to her again, just like he had that very first time he'd come to visit her house. This time was different, though. He did not look hesitant or unsure, he just looked thoughtful, like he'd been mulling something over. If you ever need a single thing, he said, his voice steady and true, I don't want you to wait for a second. You just call me, you hear? Anytime at all. Clara gave him a warm, genuine smile. I know you mean it, Ethan, and I just might. Ethan gave a firm nod, satisfied with her answer. He opened the door wider, and he stepped out of the warm house into the soft, cool Texas evening air. From the doorway, Clara watched him walk down her little stone path, and his steps were no longer strange, but steady and familiar. When he finally made it over to his dusty pickup truck, he could not help but turn and glance back one last time. He looked back at Clara, who was still framed perfectly in the warm light of the open doorway, a picture of grace. She stood there in the doorway, and then she slowly raised her hand, giving him the softest, most gentle kind of wave. Seeing her wave, Ethan felt a smile spread across his face and lifted his own hand in return, a simple gesture that felt mighty important. He then pulled himself up into the cab of his old truck, turned the key, and started rolling down the peaceful, tree-lined street. As his taillights faded down that quiet street, Clara finally brought herself to close the heavy front door, but she did it without a sound. She moved slowly, carefully, leaning her whole back against the cool wood of the door as if she needed its support to hold all her new feelings. A small but completely full smile bloomed on her face, a genuine expression of pure, simple happiness that reached all the way to her eyes. Sure, her ankle was still tender and on the mend, but goodness, her heart felt like it was finally healing too. In fact, her spirit felt lighter and more hopeful than it had in more years than she could even count. Now she could not pretend to know exactly where things between them were going to go from here. It was all so new. She had no map for the road ahead, but she did know one single thing with a powerful, unshakable feeling deep in her soul. It was a feeling of absolute certainty that this quiet, steady rancher was someone special, someone different from anyone else. He had just stepped right into her complicated life in the most surprising and completely unexpected way imaginable. It was a wonderful and unexpected turn of events, and a little part of her prayed that he would decide to stay a while. She truly hoped with all her might that he would not be stepping back out of her life anytime in the near future.